Everyone. Welcome to another edition of Lunchtime Storytime. I'm Dr. Megan, as usual, and today we are going to be reading a book that is new to me, but I'm very excited to share it with you. This is Library Lion by Michelle Knudsen, illustrated by Kevin Hawkes. So before we get into this book, though, I wanted to share another book that I have been enjoying. This is the Enchanted Forest Coloring and Inky Quest and Coloring book by Joanna Basford. This is a lot of fun if you enjoy stress relief coloring, which I do. You can see that there are beautifully detailed pictures in here. I colored this one yesterday and it was just delightful. And also there are little critters hidden in the pages, so it's a little adventure / quest as well as just hours and hours of good coloring fun. So she has a whole series of these kind of books. You can find them at bookstores, on Amazon. I got this through Better World Books. But if you are looking for a good adult coloring book or even just a fun quest coloring book, this is a really good one. So I just wanted to share that. Nobody paid me to say that, obviously. It's just something that I've been enjoying. So let us get into the show. Library Lion by Michelle Knudsen, illustrated by Kevin Hawkes. Pull this down just a little bit. One day, a lion came to the library. He walked right past the circulation desk and up into the stacks. Mr. McBee ran down the hall to the head librarian's office. "Miss Merriweather!" he called. "No running," said Miss Merriweather without looking up. "But there's a lion," said Mr. McBee, "in the library." "Is he breaking any rules?" asked Miss Merriweather. She was very particular about rule breaking. "Well, no," said Mr. McBee. "Not really." "Then leave him be." The lion wandered all around the library. He sniffed the card catalog. He rubbed his head against the new book collection. Then he padded over to the story corner and went to sleep. No one was sure what to do. There weren't any rules about lions in the library. Soon it was time for story hour. There weren't any rules about lions at story hour either. The story lady seemed a little nervous, but she read out the first book's title in a good, clear voice. The lion looked up, and the story lady kept reading. The lion stayed for the next story, and the story after that. He waited for another story, but the children began to walk away. "Story hour is over," a little girl said. "It's time to go." The lion looked at the children. He looked at the story lady. He looked at the closed books. And then he roared very loud. "Roar!" Miss Merriweather came striding out of her office. "Who is making that noise?" she demanded. "It's the lion," said Mr. McBee. Miss Merriweather marched over to the lion. "If you cannot be quiet, you will have to leave," she said in a stern voice. "Those are the rules." The lion kept roaring. He sounded sad. The little girl tugged on Miss Merriweather's dress. "If he promises to be quiet, can he come back for story hour tomorrow?" she asked. The lion stopped roaring. He looked at Miss Merriweather. Miss Merriweather looked back. Then she said, "Yes, a nice quiet lion would certainly be allowed to come back for story hour tomorrow." "Hooray!" said the children. The next day, the lion came back. There we go. The next day, the lion came back. "You are early," said Miss Merriweather. "Story hour is not until 3 o'clock." The lion did not budge. "Very well," said Miss Merriweather. "You might as well make yourself useful." She sent him off to dust the encyclopedias until it was time for story hour. And there he is, dusting the encyclopedias. The next day, the lion came early again. This time, Miss Merriweather asked him to lick all the envelopes for the order notice and fizz. Soon the lion began doing things without being asked. He dusted the encyclopedias. He licked the overdue envelopes. He let small children stand on his back to reach books on the highest shelves. Then he curled up in the story corner to wait for story hour to begin. At first, the people in the library were nervous about the lion, but soon they got used to having him around. In fact, he seemed very well suited for the library. His big feet were quiet on the library floor. He made a comfy backrest for the children at story hour, and he never roared in the library anymore. "What a helpful lion," people said. They patted his soft head as he walked by. "How did we ever get along without him?" Mr. McBee scowled when he heard that. They had always gotten along fine before. No lions were needed. Lions, he thought, could not understand rules. They did not belong in the library. One day, after he had dusted all the encyclopedias and licked all the envelopes and helped all the small children, the lion padded down to the hall to the Miss Merriweather's office to see what else there was to do. There was still some time before story hour. "Hello, Lion," said Miss Merriweather. "I know something you can do. You can bring a book back into the stacks for me. Let me just get it down from the shelf." Miss Merriweather stepped up onto the step stool. The book was just out of reach. Miss Merriweather stood on her toes. She stretched out her fingers. "Almost there," she said. Then Miss Merriweather stretched a little too far. "Ouch!" said Mrs. Merriweather. She did not get up. "Mr. McBee!" she called after a minute. "Mr. McBee!" But Mr. McBee was at the circulation desk. He could not hear her calling. "Lion," said Miss Merriweather, "please go get Mr. McBee." The lion ran down the hall. "No running!" Miss Merriweather called after him. He put his big front paws up on the circulation desk and looked at Mr. McBee. "Go away, Lion," said Mr. McBee. "I'm busy." The lion whined. He pointed his nose down the hall toward Miss Merriweather's office. Mr. McBee ignored him. Finally, the lion did the only thing he could think of to do. He looked at Mr. McBee right in the eye. Then he opened his mouth very wide, and he roared the loudest roar he had ever roared in his life. Mr. McBee gasped. "You're not being quiet," he said to the lion. "You're breaking the rules!" Mr. McBee walked down the hall as fast as he could. The lion did not follow him. He had broken the rules. He knew what that meant. He hung his head and walked toward the doors. Mr. McBee did not notice. "Miss Merriweather!" he called as he walked. "Miss Merriweather! The lion broke the rules! The lion broke the rules!" He burst into Miss Merriweather's office. She was not in her chair. "Miss Merriweather?" he asked. "Sometimes," said Miss Merriweather from the floor behind her desk, "there is a good reason to break the rules, even in the library. Now please go call a doctor. I think I've broken my arm." Mr. McBee ran to call a doctor. "No running!" Miss Merriweather called after him. The next day, things were back to normal. Almost. Miss Merriweather's left arm was in a cast. The doctor had told her not to work too hard. "I will have my lion to help me," Miss Merriweather thought. But the lion did not come to the library that morning. At 3 o'clock, Miss Merriweather walked over to the story corner. The story lady was just beginning a story for the children. The lion was not there. People in the library kept looking up from their books and computer screens, hoping they would see a familiar, furry face. But the lion did not come that day. The lion did not come the next day either, or the day after that. One evening, Mr. McBee stopped by Miss Merriweather's office on his way out. "Can I do anything for you before I go, Miss Merriweather?" he asked her. "No, thank you," said Miss Merriweather. She was looking out the window. Her voice was very quiet, even for the library. Mr. McBee frowned as he walked away. He thought there probably was something he could do for Miss Merriweather, after all. Mr. McBee left the library, but he did not go home. He walked around the neighborhood. He looked under cars. He looked behind bushes. He looked in backyards and trash cans and tree houses. Finally, he circled all the way back to the library. The lion was sitting outside, looking in through the glass doors. "Hello, Lion," said Mr. McBee. The lion did not turn around. "I thought you might like to know," said Mr. McBee, "that there's a new rule at the library. No roaring allowed, unless you have a very good reason. Say, if you're trying to help a friend who's been hurt, for example." The lion's ears twitched. He turned around, but Mr. McBee was already walking away. The next day, Mr. McBee walked down the hall to Miss Merriweather's office. "What is it, Mr. McBee?" asked Miss Merriweather in her new, sad, quiet voice. "I thought you might like to know," said Mr. McBee, "that there's a lion in the library." Miss Merriweather jumped up from her chair and ran down the hall. Mr. McBee smiled. "No running," he called after her. Miss Merriweather didn't listen. Sometimes there's a good reason to break the rules, even in the library. The end. And so that is Library Lion by Michelle Knudsen. And what a charming book it is. I love the library. I miss the library being closed for the pandemic because I used to go and check out books and DVDs. But one day we will be back and I will have the library again. So now we have another chapter of Paddington Bear. Looks like today's chapter is called Paddington Recommended. And we are at chapter 21, or page 207, which means we have just over 150 pages left. We have been doing great with the Paddington Treasury. Mrs. Brown tore open the first of the morning's mail, withdrew a large piece of white cardboard, and then stared at it in amazement. "Good gracious," she said. "Fancy that! Mrs. Smith Cholmondeley is holding a Christmas ball in aid of the local children's hospital, and we've all been invited." Paddington peered across the table with a slice of toast and marmalade poised halfway to his mouth. "Mrs. Smith Cholmondeley is holding a Christmas ball?" he repeated in great surprise. "I hope we get there before she drops it." "It isn't that sort of a ball, dear," said Mrs. Brown patiently. "It means she's having a dance," said Judy. "Who's Mrs. Smith Cholmondeley when she's at home?" asked Mrs. Brown. Mrs. Brown handed him the card. "Don't you remember, Henry? Paddington met her when he was out carol singing. She's the one he cooked the baked elastic for by mistake." "Gosh!" broke in Jonathan as he read the invitation. "She's either left it a bit late or it's been delayed in the mail. It's tomorrow night." "And that's not all," said Mrs. Brown. "Have you seen what it says at the bottom?" Paddington hurried round the table and peered over Mr. Brown's shoulder. "Rosebup!" he explained. "No, dear," said Mrs. Brown. "RSVP. That simply means Répondez, s'il vous plaît. It's French for please reply." "You mean the bit about the evening dress?" Mr. Brown looked round at Paddington, who was waving his toast and marmalade dangerously near his left ear. "Well, that's put an end to it. I suppose we shall just have to say no." There was a note of relief in Mr. Brown's voice. He wasn't too keen on dancing at the best of times, and the thought of going to a ball run by Mrs. Smith Cholmondeley filled him with gloom. But any hopes he'd entertained of using Paddington as an excuse were quickly dashed by the chorus of dismay which greeted his last remark. "I think we ought to try and arrange something, Henry," said Mrs. Brown. "After all, it's in a very good cause. It's the same hospital Paddington collected for last year, and if it wasn't for him, we shouldn't be invited anyway." "We'll take him along to Heather and Sons and have him fitted out for the evening," said Mrs. Bird decidedly, as she bustled round clearing up the breakfast things. "They hire out evening clothes, and it says in their advertisements they fit anyone while they wait." Mr. Brown eyed Paddington's figure doubtfully. "We need it tomorrow night," he said. "Not next year." Paddington looked most upset at this last remark. It was bad enough writing things in initials, let alone French ones, but having to wear special clothes simply in order to dance seemed most complicated. However, he brightened considerably at the thought of going up to London to be fitted out, and when Mr. Brown, recognizing defeat at last, announced that he would meet them afterwards and take them all to lunch as a special treat, Paddington joined in the general excitement. Paddington liked visiting London, and he couldn't wait to get started, especially when Mr. Brown brought out his copy of A Guide to Good Restaurants and began searching for a likely eating place. "They have a restaurant at Heather's now," said Mrs. Brown. "We could combine the two things. It would save a lot of trouble." Mr. Brown made a quick check. "It isn't a Duncan Hyde recommended," he said disappointedly. "He doesn't even mention it." "It only opened last week," replied Mrs. Brown, "so it wouldn't be. But not many people know about it yet, so at least it won't be crowded." "All right," said Mr. Brown. "You win." He snapped the book shut and handed it to Paddington. "Perhaps you can test a few of the dishes at lunchtime," he continued as the others hurried upstairs. "If they're any good, we'll send a recommendation to Mr. Hyde." "Thank you very much, Mr. Brown," said Paddington gratefully. He'd spent many happy hours browsing through the pages of Mr. Hyde's recommendation book, and he put it away carefully in the secret compartment of his suitcase while he got ready to go out. Duncan Hyde spent his time visiting restaurants all over the country, awarding them various shaped hats from their cooking, ranging from a very small beret for run-of-the-mill dishes to a giant-sized bowler for the very best, and some of the dishes he described were mouth-watering indeed. Although no one had ever met him, for he preferred to remain anonymous, it was widely agreed that he must be a person of great taste, and when they arrived at Heather and Sons later that morning, Paddington peered through the restaurant window with interest in case there was anyone around carrying a hat. As they trooped through the main entrance, the Browns were greeted by a man in formal clothes. "We'd like to fit this young bear for a special occasion," said Mrs. Brown. "Can you direct us to the right department, please?" "Certainly, madam. Please step this way." With scarcely the flicker of an eyelid, the supervisor turned and led the way towards a nearby elevator. "Is the young gentleman being presented at court?" he asked, glancing down at Paddington as the doors slid shut. "Or is he simply coming out?" "Neither," said Paddington, giving the man a hard stare. "I'm coming in." After the warmth of the underground, the air outside had struck a particularly cold to his whiskers, and he didn't want to be sent out again. "He's going to a ball," said Mrs. Brown hastily. "We want to hire some evening dress." "A ball?" The man looked slightly relieved. "One of the spring functions, no doubt," he remarked. "No," said Mrs. Bird firmly. "One of the Christmas ones. It's for tomorrow night, so there's no time to be lost." "It says in the advertisement you do fit anyone," said Jonathan. "While you wait," said Judy. Yes," said the supervisor unhappily. He looked down at Paddington again. "It's just that the young gentleman's legs are a bit and we may have to do some rather drastic alterations if it's to be from stock." "My legs are a bit said Paddington hotly. He began giving the supervisor some very hard stares indeed, but fortunately the elevator came to a stop before any more could be said. As the door slid open and the man gave his discreet signal to an assistant hovering in the background, Mrs. Brown exchanged glances with the others. "I was wondering," she said, "if it wouldn't be better for the rest of us to carry on with our Christmas shopping? We can all meet in the restaurant downstairs at 1 o'clock. "A very good idea, madam." The supervisor sounded most relieved. "Rest assured," he continued, as he ushered Paddington from the lift, "we will use our best endeavours and leave no stone unturned. I'll get our Mr. Stanley to look after the young gentleman. He does all our difficult cases, and there's nothing he likes better than a challenge." "That's as may be," said Mrs. Bird ominously, as the gates slid shut again. "But I have a feeling he's going to have to turn over a good few stones before that bear's fitted out. You mark my words." The Browns' housekeeper didn't entirely approve of leaving Paddington to the tender mercies of Heather and Sons, impressive though their store was, but as it happened, the supervisor's confidence in his staff was not misplaced, for no sooner had the Browns departed than everyone sprang into action. "I'll put Thimbles Martin on the job," announced Mr. Stanley, making notes as he circled Paddington with a tape measure. "He's the fastest man with the needle and thread in the business. He'll fix you up in no time at all." Looking suitably impressed, Paddington settled down to read his Duncan Hyde book while he waited, and indeed it seemed only a very short while before Mr. Stanley reappeared proudly carrying an immaculately pressed set of evening clothes. "You'll look dashing in these, and no mistake, sir," he exclaimed enthusiastically as he led Paddington into a changing room. "Quite the young bear about town," agreed the supervisor. "Mind you," he continued, allowing himself a smile of satisfaction as he helped Paddington on with the jacket, "you'll have to watch your P's and Q's. There's no knowing who you might not get mistaken for, just like that. Will you be taking them with you, or shall we send them round?" Paddington examined his reflection in the mirror, or rather, since there were mirrors on all four walls, what seemed like a never-ending line of his reflections stretching away into the distance. Although he felt very pleased to get his evening clothes so quickly, he was looking forward even more to the thought of carrying out Mr. Brown's suggestion and investigating some dishes for the guide. "I think," he announced at last, "I'll wear them, thank you very much." And disregarding the anxious expressions behind him, he picked up his belongings and headed for the lift. As Mrs. Brown had forecast, not many people knew about Heather's restaurant, and what with that, in the early hour, it was still practically empty when Paddington entered. Just inside the door there was an enormous dessert cart, and his eyes nearly popped out with astonishment as he took in the various items. There were so many different shapes, sizes, and colors he soon lost count, and it was while he was on his paws and knees examining the mounds of chocolate mousse and the oceans of fruit salads on the bottom shelf that he suddenly realized someone was talking to him. "May I be of assistance?" asked one of the waiters. Paddington stood up and raised his hat politely. "No, thank you very much," he said sadly. "I was only looking." Holding up the Duncan Hyde book, he ran his eye over the cart again. "I was hoping I might be able to do some testing later on. I think some of your dishes might be worth a bowler hat." To Paddington's surprise, his words seemed to have a magical effect on the waiter. "Pardon me, sir," he exclaimed, jumping to attention. "I didn't realize who you were. If you care to wait just one moment, sir, I'll call the manager." Bowing low as he backed away, the man disappeared from view, only to return a moment later, accompanied by an imposing figure dressed in a black coat and striped trousers. "I can't tell you," boomed the second man, rubbing his hands with invisible soap, "how delighted we are that you've decided to honor us with your presence. It's just what our restaurant needs." Taking in Paddington's dress suit, hat, and whiskers, he gave a knowing wink at the book. "I see you've been hiding your light under a bushel." "I have?" exclaimed Paddington, looking more and more surprised at the turn the conversation was taking. "We'll put you in the window, sir," announced the manager, leading the way across the floor. "We have some very special dishes today," he confided with another wink as he helped Paddington into a chair. "I'm sure we can find something to titillate your palate." "I expect you can," said Paddington, politely giving the man a wink in return, "but I'm not sure if I can afford them." "My dear sir," the man raised his hands in mock horror as he whisked the menu away, "we don't want to bother ourselves with mere money." "Don't we?" exclaimed Paddington excitedly. The manager shook his head. "You only need sign the bill," he explained. "Let's think about food first. That's much more important. We want you to feel perfectly at home." "Oh, I do already," said Paddington, grasping his knife and fork. "When can I start?" "That's what I like to see," replied the manager, beaming all over his face. "Well," he continued, rubbing his hands in anticipation, "I can certainly recommend our avocado filled with sea-fresh shrimp and cream sauce. After that," he said, "may I suggest either pot-fresh lobster, Dover-fresh sole, farm-fresh escallop of veal, or oven-fresh steak and kidney pudding?" All of the talk of food was beginning to make Paddington feel hungry, and it didn't take him long to make up his mind. "I think I'd like to try some of each," he said it rashly. If the manager was surprised, he concealed his feelings remarkably well. In fact, a look of respect came over his face as he handed Paddington's order to a waiter who was hovering nearby. "I must say," he remarked, "you take your job very seriously. There aren't many people in your position who would take the trouble to try everything on the menu. Would you care to test one of our rare old wines?" Paddington thought for a moment. "I think I'd sooner test some of your cocoa," he said. "Tin fresh cocoa." For one brief moment, the manager's calm seemed to desert him, and then he brightened. "I have a feeling you're trying to catch us out," he said, wagging his finger roguishly. "Perhaps," he added, waving in the direction of the cart, "you would care to contemplate the desserts over the cheese." Paddington gave him an odd look. "I'd sooner eat them," he said, "but I think I'd better leave a little bit of room. I'm having lunch with someone at 1 o'clock. A look of renewed admiration came over the man's face. "Well," he said, bowing his way out as the first of the dishes began to arrive, I'll leave you to your task, but I do hope you'll see fit to mention us when the time comes. And here's Paddington in his evening dress, about to eat a very large fish. Oh, yes, said Paddington earnestly. I shall tell all my friends. Paddington still wasn't sure why he was being treated in such a royal manner, but he wasn't the sort of bear to look a gift horse in the mouth, and as everyone obviously wanted him to enjoy his meal, he was only too willing to oblige. Already, quite a large crowd had gathered on the pavement outside Heather's. In fact, the window was black with faces, and it was getting darker with every passing moment. Paddington's every move was watched with increasing interest, and as he settled to his gargantuan meal, the applause that greeted each new course was exceeded only by the one which followed. But if the vast majority of the audience viewed the goings-on inside the restaurant with wonder and delight, there were 5 new members who stood watching with horror and dismay on their faces. The Browns had arranged to meet outside the store, but like most of the others passers-by, they had been drawn to the crowd gathered round the window, and now, as they pushed their way through to the front, their worst fears were realized. "Mercy me!" cried Mrs. Bird. "What on earth is that bear up to now?" "I don't know what he's up to," said Mr. Brown gloomily, as a loud groan rose from the audience. "But whatever it is, I think it's coming to an end." A sudden change had indeed taken place on the other side of the glass, and the Browns watched with sinking hearts. It all began when a waiter arrived bearing a large sheet of folded paper on a plate. Handing Paddington a pen, he stood over him with a deferential smile on his face while he signed his name. Then, gradually, this smile disappeared, only to be replaced by an expression which the Browns didn't like the look of at all. "Come on!" cried Judy, grabbing her mother's arm. "We'd better do some rescuing." "Oh, Lord," groaned Mr. Brown as they pushed their way back through the crowd. "Here we go again." Unaware that help was on its way, Paddington stared at the waiter as if he could hardly believe his eyes, let alone his ears. £56? he exclaimed. "Just for a meal?" "Not just for a meal," said the waiter, eyeing all the stains. "About 10 meals, if you ask me. We thought you were Duncan Hyde, the famous gourmet." Paddington nearly fell backwards off his chair at the news. "Duncan Hyde, the famous gourmet?" he repeated. "I'm not Duncan Hyde. I'm Paddington Brown from Darkest Peru, and I'm a bear." "In that case," said the waiter, handing back the bill, "I'm afraid it's cash. It includes the cover charge," he added meaningfully, "but not the tip." "A cover charge?" exclaimed Paddington hotly. "But I didn't even have one. It was all open." He peered at the piece of paper in his paw. £9.50 for a bomb surprise? "It's all part of the surprise," said the waiter nastily. "Well, I've got one for you," said Paddington. "I've only got 10 pence. Paddington felt most upset about the whole affair, especially as he hadn't intended eating in the first place. Apart from putting his signature on the bill as he'd been asked, he'd even added his special paw print to show it was genuine, and he looked very relieved when he caught sight of the Browns heading in his direction. Since he'd arrived, a great change had come over the restaurant, and it was now full almost to overflowing. The Browns had to weave a tortuous path in and out of the other diners, and before they were able to reach Paddington's table, they found their way barred by the manager. "Does this young gentleman belong to you?" he asked, pointing in Paddington's direction. Why do you ask?" said Mr. Brown, playing for time. "Henry!" exclaimed Mrs. Brown. "How could you?" "I've never seen you before either, Mr. Brown," called Paddington, entering into the spirit of things. Mr. Brown heaved a deep sigh as he reached for his wallet. "Since you ask," he said, "I'm afraid he does." "Afraid?" The manager stared at the Browns. "Did you say afraid?" He waved an all-embracing hand round the restaurant. "Why, this is the best thing that's happened to us since we opened. That young bear's attracted so many new customers, we don't know whether we're coming or going. There's certainly no charge." He turned back to Paddington. "I wish we could have you sit in the window every day of the week. You may not be Duncan Hyde, but you're certainly worth your weight in lobster soufflé." The manager broke off and looked at Paddington with concern. For some reason or other, his words seemed to be having a strange effect. "Are you all right, sir?" he asked. "Your whiskers seem to have gone a very funny colour. Let me help you up. Perhaps you'd like to try some of our bean-fresh coffee with cream?" Paddington gave another groan. If he'd had to make a list of his needs at that moment, getting up would have figured very low, while food and drink would have been lucky to get a mention at all. Dropping his guidebook, he sank back into the chair and felt for the buttons on his jacket. "I'd rather not do any more testing today, thank you very much," he gasped. Apart from all his other troubles, Paddington had noticed a rather ominous tearing sound whenever he moved, and although he minded his peas during lunch, he had a feeling that both Mr. Stanley and Thimblesmartin were in for a busy afternoon dealing with his cues. All the same, he had to admit that he'd never had quite such a meal in his life. "I think," he announced, "that if I were a food tester, I would award Heathers one of my uncle's hats." Mr. Brown smacked his lips in anticipation. "It must be good, then," he said, reaching for the menu. "I shall enjoy my lunch. After all," he continued, amid general agreement, "one of Paddington's hats must be worth a whole closet full of Duncan Hyde bowlers any day of the week." The end. So that is our Paddington story. I will be back tomorrow with more stories around noon. And in the meantime, enjoy the lovely weather, go out and do something fun, and have a good day.